started sharing. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, this is the Idaho Pole Superfund site public meeting, and we are recording this meeting so that we can post it on our YouTube page in the future. If you choose to speak tonight, we will be recording your voice, your face, and any username that shows up in the meeting. So with that, Roger, let's go to the next. Oh.
All right, thanks. So next slide, agenda. So 4 items. I want to introduce the site team. There's a couple of new players, at least on the state DEQ side. I'd like them to introduce themselves. Brief site overview. I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing the history of the site. Then I'll go into the soil component of the cleanup remedy and what's coming up with regards to the soil component, and do the same for groundwater component. And as it says on the bottom, and as I've always done, if anybody has a question, feel free to raise their hand and ask it at any point during the presentation. Next slide, please. And on this slide, I would like the DEQ folks who are new to the site, or at least in a new role, to go ahead and introduce themselves.
That might just be me for DEQ that's on the call. Hello, everyone. My name is Brianna Pabst. I'm the new DEQ project officer for the site, and recently started with DEQ. I have a background in chemical and bioengineering and went to school in Bozeman, so I'm really excited to be working on this project.
All right, and Beth, did you want to introduce anybody on the EPA side?
Yeah, I'll just do a couple of quick introductions. So y'all may see the name Honor Morgan in the chat. She is a new community involvement coordinator, so she is shadowing me to see what the public meeting looks like tonight. And we also have with us Jessica Smith, who is going to be helping out Roger on the project management side.
All right, next slide. Oh, probably should. All right, so the Idaho Pole site, it operated a wood treating facility for about 50 years or plus, starting a little bit after World War II and ending in 1997. They used 2 types of preservation. One was creosote that they used in the very beginning, and after a couple of years, they moved to pentachlorophenol. Both of those preservatives required a mixing with the petroleum distillate, basically to be able to dissolve it in order to apply it to the wood. There were 2 operations. If you look on the left of this picture, you'll see a butt vat where basically the lower probably 10 to 12 feet of a telephone pole may have been dipped. And then to the right, you'll see the full-length pole retorts where the entire pole was actually treated. And I was told by Northwestern Energy that a lot of the linemen prefer to have butt vat poles because it's actually easy. They're not as slippery, and the linemen are able to actually get up and be able to do work on the lines where the entire pole isn't treated. What's interesting, after this call, if you ever drive down the highway, you can actually see the difference between which poles have been treated via butt vat versus full, because you'll actually see the line between what's been preserved and what's not. Next slide, please. So this is while we were doing investigations, but not cleanup. I have 2 red arrows, and I just want to kind of hone in everybody's attention. So the first red arrow, which would be the one closest to the interstate, that's the 1,000 parts per billion concentration prior to doing any type of cleanup. Notice that it extends underneath the highway. It extends past the substation, and the second one identifies the 100 parts per billion isocontour. Now, this is pentachlorophenol. It's the primary contaminant of concern at this site. It's the most soluble of the contaminants, and we're seeing it down gradient. So this basically is our signature contaminant that we sample for to evaluate the effectiveness of the cleanup. Next slide, please. So regulatory involvement, this site's been around for a while. It's my understanding Fish, Wildlife, and Parks back in 1978 received a call from a citizen who had concerns because there was a ditch that was coming off of Idaho Pole's property going into Rocky Creek, and they had noticed wood treating fluids going into the creek. And as a result of that, the state of Montana actually placed Idaho Pole under an enforcement order. And what they were doing was they were basically using, taking some of the free product off of the surface of the groundwater and recovering it and then recycling it into their operations. That particular order expired in 1984 when the site became a Superfund site. EPA became involved at that point. We did what's called a remedial investigation and feasibility study, looking at nature and extent and evaluating various cleanup alternatives that ultimately led to what's called a record of decision, which was issued in 1992. The record of decision had both soil and groundwater remedy components. The soil remedy called for soil removal. Basically, they excavated the soils and then treated it on site. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the soil component portion. And the groundwater component consisted of extraction of the groundwater, treatment, re-injection, and I'll talk about that. I have highlighted in certain spots, you'll see red, and that's to tell me to explain exactly, you know, EPA uses a lot of acronyms and a lot of words. And in this instance, we use institutional controls. And Beth, I don't know if anybody has a hand up or anything that would like me to explain what an institutional control is, or you could do that. Is there any?
I'm not seeing any hands, but just so my quick community involvement description of an institutional control is something that's not necessarily a physical control, but typically these are more like institutional, obviously, like a a city ordinance or something that restricts the use of an area that helps to protect the remedy so that people aren't really going where they shouldn't be going and aren't disturbing areas. But I don't see any hands or any chats, so I think we're good to keep rolling along. But please feel free to interrupt us if you have any questions.
Yeah, and I do believe when I talk about the soil and groundwater components, I do talk about the institutional controls that are in place. Last bullet, Idaho Pole was placed under an EPA enforcement order to conduct cleanup. They have been a very good corporate citizen. I enjoy working with Idaho Pole, and they've been very responsive to both EPA and DEQ's requests for needs and additional work. With that, proceed to the next slide, please. So soil
one
component.
second, Roger. 1 sec. I see that there is a hand up, but I can't see you offhand. Oh, Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah. So my question is, has to do if the Supreme Court rules against certain federal regulations, which would presumably include EPA regulations, what would that mean for this site and the future health of the area?
I'm not sure whether that particular, I heard about this on NPR, so I actually appreciate you bringing up, because that was the first I had heard of it when I heard it on NPR the other day. But I don't think it's going to impact Superfund. It would be more how I envision it, like the water and the air program, where they do permitting And I think it's going to impact those programs more than the Superfund program. I could be wrong, Lynn. Let's just see how it evolves over time. And then at that point, you know, EPA will have a message that will come out to the public on how it will impact all the various rules and regulations that it is responsible for. Does that answer your question, or do you have a follow-up?
No, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, and Beth, this is probably more your bailiwick, so I apologize for not answering it. Did you have, or I apologize for answering it. Do you have anything you want to add?
I do not, and you are more prepared with NPR than I am, so I'm glad you answered it. And I don't see any other hands. I think we are ready to cruise on along to the next slide.
All right, go to the next slide. Yeah.
All right.
So this is just a quick slide so everybody can kind of see, you know, what it looked like. And I'll talk about the soil components. So basically excavation. So you see two arrows down below. The lowest arrow, the one that's closest to the interstate, that's the bark-filled area. And when this aerial photo was taken, you can kind of see that that's the area where they're excavating. The second arrow goes to where active, so this photo would have been taken prior to 1997 when operations ceased or no longer, the Idaho Pole Company was no longer working at the site. But once all the equipment and buildings were demolished, there was some soil excavations where that second arrow is. So they went to what I have above called the land treatment unit. And I'll explain a little bit more about land farming here in a little bit. So next slide, please. So 24,000 cubic yards. And if you saw the two arrows from the previous slide, you'll see the same two arrows where the excavations occurred. And those would be kind of the orange dashed lines there. So I have highlighted land farm. So basically we are farming here. So there's indigenous microbes in the soils that have an affinity. So basically their food source is the contaminant itself. So when you land farm, basically you till it because it's an aerobic microbe, so it needs oxygen. You give it food, so you add, you know, nutrients to the soils to kind of stimulate activities. And so what happens is the microbes reproduce. There's a big colony, and when those nutrients are no longer there, then they start consuming the contaminants themselves. And the last thing that you add to it is water. So it's like farming, except you're farming microbes instead of plants or animals. So the treated soils are placed in excavated areas. We call these the treated soils area. And I do want to point out that land farming is not a very efficient way to treat dioxins. So when we look at pentachlorophenol, we look at a cleanup value that's expressed in parts per million. When we look at dioxins, we look at a cleanup value that's expressed in parts per trillion. And it's a very low number. And the other thing is dioxins have an affinity to basically absorb themselves to carbon. And, you know, clay, there's a lot of carbon in the soils. So it's very hard to meet dioxin cleanup levels in parts per trillion via land farming. So I just want to note that there are exceedances of dioxins in the soils. These soils were covered with clean soil. And then I talked about institutional controls a couple of slides back. So there is deed restrictions placed on the property One of the deed restrictions is does not allow for residential use, only commercial industrial. There are restrictions on excavations, so you can't excavate into the groundwater without having some type of plan that's been reviewed and approved by the state and EPA. And you also cannot excavate in the treated soils area, again, without agency approval. And with that, next slide, please. So consolidating treated soils. So let's go to the next slide. And this, so the property was sold in 2022. Just before the property was sold, the federal government, so it was the Department of Justice on behalf of the Environmental Protection Agency, negotiated and entered into an agreement with Scout LLC and as part of a prospective purchaser agreement. This agreement provides for work that Scout would do and then payment of any agency oversight costs. So any work that myself or Brianna or Jessica or Beth would do on the site is cost recoverable through this prospective purchaser agreement. And the work components include excavation, and it's excavation of the treated soils area. And the next slide will go into a little bit more detail. But what I do want to say, or at least I want to emphasize, is we have received development plans from Scout. But just because we've received them doesn't necessarily mean that's what the plans are going to look like after they've been reviewed and approved by the city of Bozeman. So plans at this point are preliminary and subject to change until the city approves the plans. With that, go to the next slide, scope of work. So let me...
Roger, sorry, 1 second. Amy has her hand up. Amy, did you want us to go over this slide and then ask your question, or do you want to ask it now?
I was going to ask just about the, the development potential, if we are going to get any kind of a preview of what the thoughts are. It's always my feeling that it's better to inform the residents sooner rather than later about what, until, not putting a plan out that's fully developed, that's the first time that people hear about it. So I was just wondering if we would be able to get kind of a preview of what Scout is thinking.
Roger, you want me to jump in?
Yes, please, Casey.
Hi.
And please introduce yourself.
My name is Casey Tippins. I'm the developer, and we did send over basically a colored sketch of some ideas that we had, and it really was more to inform the conversation around one of the upcoming slides, I think, about potential for treating the soils that are left on site. As far as our development plans, we plan to hold a community meeting with the Northeast Neighborhood Association and most likely anyone from the city of Bozeman, probably in the second quarter of this year, May or June. And we'll be kind of laying everything out for discussion and for input and to get that conversation going before we submit anything to the city.
Thank you.
And Beth, I'm going to speak from this slide, but the next slide has a figure that I think, it may hone in better by me discussing it. If you don't mind going to the next slide.
Yep, I will pop on over the next one. There we go. And
all right, so the first...
sorry, a quick question for the audience, since I'm screen sharing. Can y'all see the sidebar that has the audience, or can you just see the slide?
I see both. The
Okay,
slide.
Let me minimize that so it's not in the way. There we go. Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, sorry, Roger, go ahead.
Oh, that's fine. So on this particular slide, if you look between I-90 and Cedar Street, you'll see like a dashed line going through that area. And that's the inferred floodway boundary that FEMA recently reestablished the floodway boundaries for the city. Well, it's probably nationwide, but this was the one for city of Bozeman. And I believe we had a call in 2020 with Nina, and somebody had mentioned this. And what I do want to say is whoever mentioned it, we appreciate it. We took it very seriously. And one of the work components that Scout is proposing to do is get all of that waste that's currently in the floodplain out of the floodplain. So the intent is we have a 4.5 acre footprint for the treated soils. By taking it out of between Cedar Street and I-90, the footprint will be reduced by 2 acres. So it's a much smaller footprint that we're having to manage it as a repository. You'll also see close to the rail line another area that's highlighted in orange. And again, this is a preliminary drawing and subject to change, but the intent there is you have groundwater based on wells that we have in that place, that it's about 17 feet before we hit groundwater close to the rail lines, whereas the closer you get to I-90, it's probably closer to 7 or 8 feet. So what Scout is proposing to do is bring their utilities in there, because given the depths of the groundwater in this area, they're not likely to encounter groundwater, but they also need to move those soils in order to be able to bring the utilities in. So there's a couple of 100 cubic yards of soil that will be moved and consolidated. So one of the things we're working with Scout on, and this was again a issue that was brought up by Nina in a previous meeting about concerns of excavating these soils with the dioxins in them. And one of the things that we did, so last month we collected multiple samples of soil from the repository. And what we're planning to do is laboratory testing. Basically, we're looking at whether or not there's a way that we could add some type of reagent to those soils to reduce the concentrations of dioxins, that it not only would be below the ROD standard. So the cleanup standard here at this site is 1,000 parts per trillion. But what we're looking at is to actually try to get the dioxin standards below or at 200 parts per trillion, which is a much lower cleanup level. And we feel that this kind of addresses some concerns that have been raised by the community about excavating these soils. So in addition to, once they excavate and consolidate, we're going to have an impermeable barrier. And I'm just using at this point that it may be a parking lot. Again, that's subject to change based on what the final design looks like. And the other thing is Scout LLC is going to be responsible for this repository. So they are responsible for maintaining and operating this repository at the site. And with that, please move to the next slide, Beth. So soil excavation components, I did say work TBD. And again, Casey kind of said that he's going to kind of present something to the community around early summer, late spring. I envision, and Casey, correct me if I'm wrong, that if we are moving these soils, it's probably not going to happen until late fall 2024 or winter of 2025. Would that be a reasonable time frame for your schedule?
Yeah, I think we would target before winter 2024.
Okay. So we do, as part of the prospective purchaser agreement, we do require a work plan, but we understand that it's hard for Scout to give us a work plan until the development plan with the city of Bozeman isn't approved, and Scout can't really proceed with presenting a development plan until they know with certainty that this treatability study is going to work. So there's a lot of moving parts here as it pertains to the soil excavation. Needless to say, during excavation, we are going to have an agency present on site. We will have periodic community briefings and updates. And Beth, you and I talked about what we did at the Carpenter Snow Creek site in Nyhart with the county commissioners. And I don't know if you want to kind of add how we kind of see how we're going to do updates for this particular soil excavation.
Yeah, so I'd love to talk about just really quickly. What we did on one of the other sites was we provided updates as the work was happening. These were emails that went out to city and county officials who were interested in the work. It was just like a quick couple lines of what work was happening at that time so that people could follow along. And we kept the website updated with the latest work plan so that people could see the work as it progressed. So I'd imagine that we could mirror something similar here. And we do really want to make the website an accessible place where folks can find good information. And Roger, I will just add that I did get a question about who pays for the treatability study. And my understanding is that is Scout, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, perfect.
All right, so I got one last slide and then I'll open it for questions. So, you know, we're holding, I guess, go to the next slide, okay? So we're hoping that the laboratory testing would work, and we would probably follow that up with a field test just to do verification of the lab test. But say what happens if the laboratory testing doesn't work and we're still going to move the soils? And I know this was a concern that was raised by Nina in a previous meeting about, okay, we're a little bit concerned that dioxins may get off site. So we would require air monitoring and where those air monitoring stations would be located. That's something that we would negotiate with Scout LLC. There would be different best management practices, and everybody knows in Montana, wind can pick up at any minute, especially during the summer in the afternoon or fall. And we want to make sure that should the wind pick up, that there is not fugitive dust that contains this dioxin. So we are going to require construction best management practices to mitigate the dust. And in my mind, if this is the way we go, because the laboratory testing is not successful, there will be either a DEQ or EPA employee on site for the entire time that Scout's contractor is out there doing the work. And with that, I have it open.
So
Next slide would be
question, for Roger. Sorry.
Yeah, you can go to the next slide because it's questions or comments.
Questions or comments. So one question that I received from Katie: will the dust monitoring be real time if that scenario happens?
We would like to make it real time. That is correct.
And I'm just looking. Kim, did you have a question?
I did.
Go ahead.
So my in-laws own the end of Cedar Street. They have a business, Montana Crane Service, and we know Casey. I'm just kind of concerned when they were doing the stuff for the soil, quote unquote remediation last year, all of the trees down there died. They're on wells. We are on wells as well. I'm just kind of concerned with like the water quality and like what's gonna happen there.
Okay, so the groundwater, and this is a groundwater component, but I'm happy to answer the question now. Travels kind of northwest. So if you do have a well for potable use,
No, we have a well.
no, that's what I'm saying. So if you have a well in that area, that the where we injected the groundwater wouldn't be migrating that particular way. Okay, it migrates towards the interstate and then goes under, and then Idaho Pole has several properties to the north of the interstate, and the chemical oxidant that we would have injected would have gone that way. Les, are you on the call? Do you see Les on the
Yes,
call?
Les is on the call. There you go, Les.
Yep, no, I'm on the call.
Based on the fact that this is being brought up as a concern, would you be willing to pick up sampling of the well for a few quarters just to alleviate some concerns that are being raised?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, and this would be a little, her concerns aren't necessarily for the pentachlorophenol. It would be more for some of the like nitrates, sulfates, things like that. So if that's something you're willing to do, our next sample event is probably going to be in May. I'll make sure to work with Ben and Heidi, your contractors, to set it up. And if you don't mind, could you put your contact information just in the chat so we have that information? And then when we're ready to sample, we'll go ahead and contact you. Do you want more than that? Because at this point, I need the data to see whether or not there's a problem.
I don't know if you're talking to me.
I was, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I was talking to Nick. I mean, I know you've met Nick, right? He's sitting right here too. Yeah, no, that'd be fine. I'll put that in there. I just it's a little like concerning, and so I just want to make sure like everything's good.
Yeah, and I was kind of surprised that the trees didn't come back this year. They really did react very quickly when we injected. Those leaves dropped right away, but
I mean, they died so fast, and
I
it
know.
was kind of crazy. And everyone that works there, I mean, we don't have a lot of employees. I mean, maybe like 15, but they were all kind of like, huh, I wonder what's happening down there, and it brought up some concerns. And then they told us that they would come back, and they didn't. So it makes me think what you're actually putting in there and what's really happening. So I don't know. I just have some concerns.
That's fine. And what we'll try to do also is see whether or not your well is in Montana. So they have what's called the Groundwater Information Center. Like any well that's in the state of Montana should be in this particular database. We could take a look and see whether or not we can find your well and find at what depth your well is screened at too. because I would assume, you know, that shallow groundwater, you know, it probably isn't as great of a potable source, and you might actually have a deeper well that's in a deeper horizon than the shallow horizon where we injected the chemical oxidant. But let us find that out. So as part of our, you know, upfront investigative work, we'll look and see whether or not we can find your well log in the Montana database.
I appreciate that. That sounds great.
All right, and they're on site next week. We're doing some work, which I'm going to talk about here in a little bit, and I'll make sure that we bring that up with Idaho Pole's contractor.
Perfect.
All
Thank you
right.
guys so much.
You're welcome. So groundwater component, next slide, Beth. All right, so groundwater remedy component, as I mentioned earlier, is extraction, treatment, and then re-injection. We use what's called a granulated activated carbon unit. Basically, the contaminant would soar to the carbon. I kind of mentioned that dioxin has an affinity for carbon. Pentachlorophenol also has an affinity for carbon as well. We added nutrients to the treated water before it was injected, and that was more to stimulate microbial growth so that the microbes in the subsurface could consume any of the residual contamination that would have been underneath the interstate. During the time from 1997 to 2016, we treated 600 million gallons. I do want to point out before we turned off the groundwater treatment system in 2016, the previous 4 years, we were treating 100 gallons per minute, but we were only getting 2 to 3 pounds of contaminant per year. And it wasn't the remedy, don't get me wrong, it worked spectacularly in the beginning, but at some point, the pump and treat system is no longer an effective treatment system, and we were looking at various options to try to address the residual contamination. So in addition to the treatment of the water, we also do twice a year sampling of monitoring wells throughout both south and north of the interstate. And then we also sample all of the residential properties. So I want to say there's 8 properties to the north that have wells that have been sampled for almost 30 years. And none of those wells have ever had an exceedance of pentachlorophenol since we've been sampling. And the other thing is we have, again, institutional controls for the groundwater component. And then in this instance, we worked with the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, DNRC, and they imposed a restriction on groundwater use, both on the Idaho Pole property south of the interstate, extending north, and the controlled groundwater boundary is just about where where it ends is just about where the dog park is. So that's the end of it, and it extends there. None of the wells that are on private property are within the controlled groundwater area. They're all outside of the controlled groundwater area. With that, next slide, please, Beth. So aquifer characteristics. So there are 3 horizons. And if you want to go ahead and show the next slide while I talk on this one, yeah, it may be beneficial. So on that particular figure, you could kind of see the clay, almost like the brown. those are kind of the clay layers. So we've identified 3 horizons: an A horizon, a B horizon, and a C horizon. And there's kind of a clay silt that delineates the 3 horizons. And in between those, you have very transmissive sands and gravels. So the groundwater that travels through those sands and gravels travels pretty quick. We've estimated that it can travel up to about 3,000 feet per year. And we've also noted that these are impervious clay layers, and there's limited connection between the A, B, and C horizons. Groundwater at the site could be anywhere between 4 and 17 feet below surface. And 17 feet would be the rail, where the rail lines are. 4 feet would be as you get closer to Rocky Creek. Depths to groundwater north of the rail tracks. This will be the next slide, but I think I already talked about why it's important that we're bringing utilities in by the rail line as opposed to along Cedar Street. And it has to do with depths to groundwater. And with that, you want to go to the next slide. So one of the things here, so this is after implementation of the soil and groundwater remedy. So I had a slide from 1990, and I identified where the 1,000 parts per billion isocontour line was for pentachlorophenol, as well as the 100. So the 100 extended past L Street in 1990, and the 1,000 extended past the substation. So once we started treating both the soils and the groundwater, the 1,000 parts per billion is no longer to the south of I-90, and the 100 parts per billion has shrunk. So what used to be the 1,000 parts per billion in 1990 is now the 100 parts per billion contaminant zone. And you'll see I have various figures just showing over time how the concentrations have been reduced. So with that, next slide, please. So when prior to turning off the water treatment plant, we introduced some we did some investigations, and we identified, isolated pockets of wood treating fluids that just, you try to get everything when you do soil excavation. You're not always successful. And so there were some isolated pockets of wood treating fluids.
It's just a screen, yeah.
Sorry, I just muted you, but Beth, if you have a question, feel free to pop off mute. All right.
So in 2015, we added ammonium nitrate to the water, and that was more to stimulate microbial activity to kind of consume it. We sampled for the microbes. We also sampled for the contaminants of concern. One of the things that we did note is the filters. So when you bring water in, you filter it before it goes through the GAC units. They were fouling because of how much microbial mass we were extracting. So that demonstrated that the microbes were actually doing their job by introducing ammonium nitrate. So next slide. So this would be the following year. So in 2016, we took it a little bit further, and we added more ammonium nitrate. And what we tried to do was added 7,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate. We also added a surfactant. Basically, what you're trying to do is scrub the contamination. Like I said, PCP has an affinity for carbon. So what the surfactant would do is it would kind of scrub that PCP off of the soils so that it would become in a dissolved phase and more likely to be consumed by the microbes. So that's what we did in 2016. So with that, go to the next slide, please. In addition, we've been monitoring both sides of the interstate since 2016. And the initial, and I have some figures showing this to support it, the concentrations we were seeing and the limited amount of PCP we were extracting through pump and treat supported permanent shutdown of the groundwater recovery system. So in December of 2016, we allowed for it to shut down. So with that, go to the next slide, and I'll try to go through these pretty quick. So notice now, and the other slides didn't distinguish between the A and B horizon. It was just, here's the contamination, irregardless of the zone or the horizon. So the A horizon is that shallow horizon. So this is what the A horizon looked like a little bit after we injected the ammonium nitrates, but prior to us turning off the water treatment plant. Next slide, please. So this is 2 years later, 2018. So what you're basically seeing in that A horizon is, as a result of us injecting these ammonium nitrate, you can see the plume actually splitting, and that stuff that's north of the interstate, that was already there prior to us injecting the ammonium nitrate, and it's residual contamination that will flush out with time. But you can kind of see that shallow zone, the plume kind of splitting up. So go now to the B horizon, which would be the next slide. So this is the deep one. So this is what we were seeing in 2016 as a result of, and this would be prior to turning off the water treatment plant. So now go to the next slide. So you can kind of see an expansion of the contaminant after we discontinued in that B horizon. And
Roger, we've got a question here from David.
Yeah, Roger, just a quick question. What are the contour line levels? 100 and 1,000?
No, here it's 10 and 1.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sorry about that. So there's a few things going on here, and you get a few hydrogeologists in the room. I'm sure they can come up with other things besides what I have here. But one, when you're extracting and injecting, the water finds preferential pathways. And what I think is that those preferential pathways probably clean themselves up pretty good. But when we stopped pumping, the water basically found its steady state, how it originally was migrating. And some of those preferential pathways probably still had some residual contamination. So as that groundwater came back to steady state, it was basically moving through, and you were getting some PCP mass as a result of turning off the pump and treat system. The other thing I think may have occurred is we had a 20-foot screen. So we were extracting water down to 25 feet. So if you're extracting 100 gallons per minute, you're pulling not only water down, but you're pulling contaminant down into that B zone probably as well, and just as a result of operating the pump and treat system. And when we turned it off, that residual contamination is just slowly migrating. I have a controlled groundwater area in place. All of the contaminant is still within that controlled groundwater area. It is not outside of that boundary. And then the third thing that I think is happening here is you do have that pentachlorophenol that soared to that clay soils. And over time, that contamination will back diffuse. Basically, as the groundwater flows over that clay, it diffuses into the B zone in addition to diffusing into the A zone. So those are the things that I think are occurring just as a result of turning it off, and why we're seeing higher concentrations in the B zone as a result of the turnoff. So with that, let's go with the next slide. So when the property was going up for sale, we were in the middle of looking at basically, okay, what are we going to do as an alternative now that we're no longer doing pump and treat? And with the sale of the property, there were some concerns that, and I'm not saying this would have happened, but you know, we always got to think the worst when we talk at EPA. But we were concerned that, you know, with the sale of the property, Idaho Pole would basically take those proceeds from the sale and dissolve as a company, and then we could no longer go after them. So we felt that rather than try to do the process of going through the feasibility study, trying to get a record of decision, negotiating a consent decree with Idaho Pole and doing the work, which probably would have taken 3 to 5 years, it was much better to tie up some of the proceeds from the sale of the property and then put it into work that would ensure that we're dealing with the contamination in the groundwater. So some of the work components that are as part of this administrative order on consent that we have with Idaho Pole, and that would be the next slide, if you don't mind, Beth. So key considerations. Okay, so we felt in situ amendments. So this in situ chemical oxidant, it's a little bit different from what we were doing in 2015 and 2016. And what we did in 2015 and 2016 worked. Not gonna lie. Our issue was we did not put enough of the ammonium nitrate into the subsurface. So as part of this work that was done in 2022, we just hit it, man, like really hard. And the other thing about these in situ amendments, even though, you know, we kind of, you know, the feasibility study leads to a proposed plan, and in the proposed plan, we recommend a particular cleanup alternative. And that would normally go through a community participation, or, you know, community would have input in that. Now, in this instance, the community didn't have input in the remedy, but the in situ chemical oxidant that we implemented was the most protective remedy alternative that we were considering in a draft feasibility study, and in all likelihood would have been the alternative that we would have carried forward into the process. So what I'm trying to say here is Superfund's a very slow process. It's not going to take, it would have taken too long for us to get to a ROD and then negotiate an enforcement order with Idaho Pole. Whereas redevelopment is, you know, with the sale of the property, we were thinking at the time it would be further along today than it is. But I understand with kind of interest rates rising, you got to be a little bit more prudent with regards to how you get your money for development. The other thing
Roger,
is
oh, can I ask a quick question here?
Yes, you may.
Chat. So I think the question is, what's the first name of EPA's consultant? Someone has Morgan as a last name, but EPA doesn't have any consultants on this. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to, or if Casey wants to speak to their consultants.
They want to know who the consultants are on the site.
Yeah, Kim, do you want to clarify? So we do have Honor Morgan, who is a EPA Community Involvement Coordinator, who's listening in on the call, but EPA doesn't have consultants or contractors on this one at the time.
I rely on in-house expertise. So we have an array of technical experts, not only in the region, but also there's a environmental response team that we can tap into. So I rely more on in-house expertise as opposed to a contractor.
Yeah.
Idaho Pole has hired Hydrometrics and they provide support to Idaho Pole. And from the environmental aspects for Scout LLC, they hired Weston as their environmental contractor. Does that answer your question?
Go ahead.
I was just curious who,
Okay.
going forward, that would be like a good contact for the EPA.
So Roger is the best contact.
Roger. Okay.
Yeah. And Kim, if you go to the EPA website, this is obviously my plug. We've got the site contacts on there, but if you want, I'm happy to message you both Roger and Jessica's contact information, since they'll both be project managers on the site.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. Kim, I'm not sure if I have your email. Do you mind sending it to me in a direct message? Would that be all right?
No, that's totally fine.
Okay. Perfect.
I will do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks, Roger, for answering that.
Oh, you're fine. So
Sorry
let's
to
go to the
interrupt you.
next. Let's go to the next slide. So next slide basically talks about the injections. So these would have been the injections that were done south of the interstate, where the trees died. So it was a 26,000 square foot area. There you can kind of see Cedar Street, and you can also see the log cabin right there, kind of where IW3 is. So you can kind of see the area where we injected. And we injected 195,000 pounds of sodium persulfate. And it was in 300 injection points. The injection points were spaced about 10 feet apart, so 10 by 10. And we did 2 5-foot intervals. So we would drill down to about 20, 21 feet, or wherever we hit refusal. We would basically open it up. We would inject high pressure air. So basically we fracked it before we injected it. Then we would pull it up 5 feet and do the same. So each hole had 2 injection points. And what really surprised me, because I had never done a chemical oxidant project before, was so we used 195,000 pounds, but really only 15,000 pounds went to the actual contaminant itself. The remaining sodium persulfate was to the soil oxygen demand. So the carbon that's in that soil was so high that we had to inject more so that we would get rid of that, basically reduce the soil oxygen demand of that soil, so that the remaining sodium persulfate would actually go towards treating the contaminant. And with that, go to the next slide, please. So in addition to what we did.
Oh, Roger, 1 second. We've got another question from Kim. Sorry.
That's fine.
Go ahead, Kim.
Oh, I hate to do this, but
No, please.
like I said, work down that road. My in-laws live down there. We saw what you guys were doing there. Do you really think that you like made a difference? I mean, there was a lot of impact happening just with you being there.
I do have some slides showing the reductions in contaminant concentrations as a result of that. And there'll be just a couple of slides after these, this one right here.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
All right, so in addition to what we did south of the interstate, we put in what's called a permeable reactive barrier. So basically we injected, and in here we didn't inject sodium persulfate, we injected potassium and sodium persulfate, basically because it's going to have a longer life. It's going to be there longer, whereas the sodium persulfate is going to get consumed really rapidly just as a result of what's going on in the subsurface. So we did 110 injection points. It's about a 450, maybe a little bit longer permeable reactive barrier. And based on the fact that we use the potassium persulfate, this particular barrier has an extended life of about 3 to 5 years. So with that, go to the next slide, please. So here, this is our samples that we took in October. So this pretty much shows you what the A horizon as a result of us injecting kind of looks like. And so we do see contaminant in GM4. And I am going to talk about this a little bit later because we're going to be doing some work on GM4 next Tuesday. But when we injected, there was kind of contamination actually bubbled up to the surface as a result of us injecting. And we flooded that ditch because we had some remaining contaminant, and we flooded that ditch hoping that the residual contamination that came to the surface would, for the most part, get consumed by this contaminant. It didn't consume it all, and we're still seeing concentrations in GM4. Now, the drinking water standard for pentachlorophenol is 1 part per billion. And to put 1 part per billion into perspective, it would be an Olympic-sized pool. So think 50 meters by 50 meters by 3 meters deep. You add 1 drop into that Olympic-sized pool and mix it. That is 1 part per billion. That's all it takes to exceed the drinking water standard. We are seeing here, and again, it's an exceedance. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but we're seeing concentrations at about 14 in the well immediately north of the interstate. So go to the next slide, which would be the B horizon for 2023. So what we're seeing here, and again, we're not seeing any contamination in the B horizon to the south of the interstate. And as you can see, based on what we saw in 2018, the B horizon is shrinking, and you do see like 1 circle, so 25B, that is above 10 parts per billion. And then all the others, again, they are exceedances, are below 10 parts per billion. So with
Roger,
that,
we've got one question. We've got a hand raised and a couple of questions in the chat.
all right, go for it.
So Amy, why don't you go first?
Well, I guess I'm having a hard time following all these numbers on the slides. Like can you go back to the previous one where you were talking? Oh, no, where you were talking about that, GM4 well to the north of the interstate, but there are much bigger numbers below that, like this 35.5 and 176. I mean, what are those numbers referring to? 292?
Those are numbers referring to what's in the source area. I do have some slides showing what they
That's
were.
the treated area?
That's the treated soils area, and it's still high, I'm not gonna lie to you, but we do see a trending, everything's going down as a result of the treatment. And I do have individual wells, well, I'll show over a couple of years in that source area, what the concentrations were prior and then what they are today.
Okay, and then all of that, theoretically is going to be moved to closer to the railroad.
The soils would be moved. We're looking at groundwater here.
Oh, okay. Okay. That's it then.
Answer your
Thanks.
question?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
All right. You had other questions?
Yeah, I've got one more. I've got a couple, like one person said that it seems like pretty toxic stuff. And then one person was asking why anyone would want to develop or live there. So I'll take kind of the first stab at this and then I'll shoot it over to you, Roger. But from EPA's perspective, we have seen a lot of Superfund sites where redevelopment can be done safely and is a good use of that land, because often the Superfund designation can be kind of a negative mark on the community. No one wants to like engage in areas that can be dangerous, but there are lots of ways where redevelopment can be done safely and then take that land back into productive reuse. So that is one of EPA's priorities, to support that however we can and make sure that the land doesn't just sit there as this blemish on the community. So I know that that is a big consideration in how we move forward on this. And Roger, do you want to add anything to that?
Actually, I thought you did a pretty good job.
Okay. And any follow-up on that? Just want to give y'all a second here. Okay. I don't see anything immediately, but feel free to raise your hand or pop anything in the chat as we keep cruising along.
All right, just bear with me. I think I got 4 or 5 more slides. So, who asked the question about the source area wells?
Was that you, Amy? These ones?
I was talking about my question was more for the previous slide, but
Yeah,
just these numbers.
so,
Yeah, so 10
Sorry.
in that
There we
slide, 10.2 is the highest, looks like the highest number. But in this slide, because
So-
you were focusing on that GM4, which is 14, but there's way bigger concentrations.
and the reason why I focused on GM4 because it was outside of the property boundaries,
Yes, okay.
south of the interstate.
Yep.
And I kind of said, okay, this is migrating to the north. And I wanted to explain why we were seeing it in GM4. And it had more to do with the fact that there was just some residual contamination that was in that ditch. And we think that's what's sourcing of what we're seeing in GM4.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't,
No,
I
that's great.
understand
Thank
your concern. So here's some wells. So you can kind of see when we initially turned off the water treatment plant in 2016, you can kind of see in these source area wells, a spike that was as a result of turning it off. And then, you see seasonal fluctuations, higher concentrations, in the spring than the fall. And that makes sense because groundwater rises. So you have kind of 2 feet more that's saturated, and there's some residual contamination in that kind of saturated zone that's getting dissolved. So those are your seasonal fluctuations. But in all of these that I'm showing here, you can see a corresponding decrease in concentrations over time. And these are the source area wells south of the I-90. So with that, go to the next slide.
One more question on this slide here, Roger. So someone asked if it's possible that contaminants are coming under the freeway to get to that groundwater monitoring well 4.
You know, having been in the field and seen the actual contamination bubbling in up to the surface when it happened and how close it was to GM4, I'm of the opinion it's residual contamination. And for the most part at the surface, because we took soil samples afterwards and we didn't see it in the soils at the immediate surface, what I'm thinking is there's probably some residual that's in close proximity to the well screen of GM4 that's sourcing it.
Okay. Thanks, Roger.
All right, do you want to go to the next slide?
Let me see. I do have a couple comments in the chat, just some preference for the land that someone is not in support of redevelopment and thinks it might be the best choice to leave the land undeveloped. And then a question on development kicking up that could affect soil, groundwater, and air. So Lynn, I wonder if it's okay for us to get through the rest of these slides and then jump back to your question. Would that be all right with you?
Sure, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So Roger, can I pop to the next slide?
Yes, please.
Okay, excellent. And thanks for your patience. I appreciate it.
All right, so these are some of the wells north of I-90. Basically, you can kind of see that red line being the 1 part per billion. And these are the wells north. You can kind of see it fluctuating, but for the most part, since maybe 2021, we've had close to the cleanup level, but we're not seeing exceedances. And these are the A wells, by the way, in the mid plume north of I-90. Next slide. So these are the deep wells north of the I-90, 25, 26, and 27B. So you can kind of see, and this data goes back to 2006. You can kind of see in 2006 some of the concentrations we were seeing in this well, and then we got down close to cleanup levels around 2014. You see 2 lines there. When we turned off the water treatment plant, that's the purple one, and when we did our injections. So, and I showed this slide when I showed 2018. You're seeing that rebound effect in 2018. So you are seeing increases, but if you look at the trends over time for these 3 wells, they are all going down. And in my conceptual site model is we have residual contamination in the B horizon. It is slowly, flushing itself out and being consumed by the microbial community. And given time, it will no longer be a issue, and it will be below detections because there is no source coming from south of the interstate that is going to be sourcing that plume, because we've pretty much addressed that through the injections of the chemical oxidant in 2022. Next slide. So this particular well, this is one of the wells, by the way, that had high concentrations when you were, somebody had asked the question about the wells south of the interstate. So this is a well that, around the time that we turned off the water treatment plant, had levels as high as 3,000, whereas now it's closer to 500. So I just want to point this well. This is another well. It has concentrations. They are exceedances, but you also see a downward trend on this one And if you don't mind, go to the next slide, please. So this is that GM4 where, look, you know, we had very low concentrations up until we injected. And I kind of said that we saw contaminants when we injected. So when we sampled in October, we saw a spike. Then in the springtime, it went down. Then in the fall, it went back up. And then this latest one, because this particular graph was not what did not have the October data on it. So I drew a line basically showing where that October result is. So we're seeing seasonal fluctuations there. So what exactly are we going to do about these two particular wells? So what we plan to do next Tuesday is we're going to inject 50 gallons of sodium permanganate, and it's going to be split between the two wells. So we're going to put 25 gallons in 5A and 25 gallons in GM4, more as a pilot test to see whether or not we are going to see reductions in concentrations in the wells. And one of the things, you know, I'm thinking in these wells have been around for a long time. And there was a time back in the 90s, early 2000s, where these wells had concentrations in the thousands. And in all likelihood, because of the age of the well, there's probably, you know, like emulsified pentachlorophenol, little droplets of PCP that are probably embedded into the actual well casing and or in the sand pack that we put around the casing. So what we want to do on these two particular wells is if we inject this sodium permanganate in there and allow kind of the well, clean up that well, is that going to result in decreases in concentrations in the wells? So we're basically trying that out next week. So I do believe that next one's my last slide. And I've pretty much talked about everything on here. So we're going to inject next week. We have an ongoing treatability study looking at dioxin concentrations in the TSA soils. Casey had mentioned fall as probably being the appropriate time to do the work for consolidation of the treated soils. We do sample groundwater both in the spring and the fall. Initial development of the property, again, that's contingent more upon Casey working with the city, but it's probably going to be hot and heavy on this particular site next year. And then the other thing we have coming up is a 5-year review. And what the 5-year review does is it's basically a checkup to see how the remedy is performing. And so we are going to take a look next year at this particular remedy, both the soil and groundwater components. And out of that 5-year review, there's normally issues that are identified with recommendations for proceeding forward with site closure. And with that, I am done with my presentation, Beth, and you may go to the next slide.
Okay, so I did see we had that question on redevelopment that I wanted to come back to. And I think I can probably stop sharing my screen now, but I'm happy to jump back into the presentation for that. So Lori, or not Lori, sorry, Lynn, you had the question, what does development or construction kick up or otherwise affect with soil, groundwater, and air?
Right. That is my question.
Yep, so I will direct that to Casey, I think. Casey, we're not hearing you.
I'm looking at the question, what does development, construction, kick up, or otherwise affect soil, groundwater, or air? And I think Roger addressed some of the dust concerns early on when we were talking about the treatability study and then the consolidation of the soils. And that we will be required to really make sure that all the protections are in place when we're doing that work. And then we are really staying out of the groundwater with any of our development that we have planned. Really just, during development construction, we're really focused on the treated soils area, which is right there in the middle. And really the goal is to consolidate that into one spot out of the floodplain and put a permanent cap on it so that we don't really have to worry about it.
So the fugitive dust that Roger mentioned, fugitive dust is just a great name for a garage band, I think. Wouldn't fugitive dust be occurring throughout the construction phase? And what happens when it settles on the ground or plants or on people? What would the effects be? And that might be a question for somebody from EPA.
I would also add, we're not building anywhere on the treated soils area. So other construction that happens elsewhere on site is really outside of any of those contamination areas.
Oh, so what would be on the treated areas?
We're putting a permanent parking lot.
Thanks.
And Lynn, so the fugitive dust would be the time it takes to excavate and consolidate. And we're not talking a lot of soils. So, you have a good equipment operator fairly close. So you could probably do your haul truck route. I would say you could fill it up, turn it around, and dump in probably 15 minutes. And probably each haul truck would hold about 10 cubic yards. You may have 2 haul trucks running. So you could move feasibly, let's say 60 cubic yards an hour, 480 cubic yards a day. You're moving 3,000 cubic yards. You're only working for 7 days. So it's a very limited window that it would take to move the soils as well.
All right.
Does that answer your question, Lynn?
It answers my question, but it doesn't address a question that then came up in the chat.
So I do want to go to Marcia, who raised her hand, and then I'll go over to the questions in the chat, just trying to go in order here, if that's all right.
I'm okay if you want to take that just to stay with the thread. I'm also curious about that, having lived next to what's happening at Canyon Gate, just a half mile away. Dust flew every day while they were peeling off the topsoil and piling it up with supposedly best practices. The dust was flying, whether it was a windy day or not. And I also am concerned about that. I do have other questions, but if you want to follow that thread, I'm all in for that.
Okay, thanks, Marcia. So one of the questions was, how do we get info on best practices for moving dioxin and whether outside monitoring is effective? And then the second one was about getting alerted if dust reaches a dangerous level, especially since someone lives directly across the tracks with a young child.
So one of the things I do want to point out now is, and it's been a while since I looked at this data, but I recall looking at wind directions, and wind directions are again based off of the airport, which is not exactly the same spot here, but wind directions aren't normally like blowing from the north to the south. They're more kind of blowing north to the east, like in that direction. I'm not trying to say that dust isn't a concern, but the majority of the time, should wind be blowing, it's not going to be blowing towards the tracks. It's going to be blowing towards the interstate. That still doesn't mean that we still need to address the dust, but I do want to kind of emphasize that the way the wind blows is it normally won't blow to the south.
That seems, I don't know, I'm just interjecting this here, and maybe the person asking the question would feel differently about it. This is Marcia talking. But that seems like it's, this just sounds rude, and I don't mean it that way, but it seems irrelevant. Anywhere the wind blows from that site is surrounded by people now living here in Bozeman. And so what we want to do is hear that the dioxins will not be blowing in the wind. And
we're going to work with Scout to ensure that we're going to minimize the dust while we're moving those soils.
And we're also going to be looking for a time window that we're not going to be kicking up and working in the dirt when we have any expectation of any kind of high winds, or we're just not going to get into that situation. So we're gonna avoid any risk of having that dust get kicked up and carried away.
Casey, one of the BMPs is we have water trucks on there, and
Absolutely. Yeah,
some of the concerns that are being raised on here. I know normally in a construction project, we may run that water truck once, twice a day, really depending on weather conditions. But in here, just because of some of the concerns that are being raised, it might be something we might want to consider running continuously.
I agree. I wouldn't think any kind of dust is acceptable.
All right, I am seeing a couple comments about wind direction and concerns about the dust. There was one question about where the contaminated soil is being moved to.
They're being moved probably 300 feet, maybe a little bit more from, maybe 500 feet from south of Cedar Street to north of Cedar Street. And Beth, I don't know if you still have the presentation on, but there was, in the soil component portion, there was showing where the treated soils areas were.
1 second, I'm trying to pull that up. And then while I pull that up, there was a question about if the trucks moving the soils will be covered while they move them.
And that's something we can work with Scout LLC on.
Is this a slide you were thinking of, Roger?
A couple slides ahead, just so that you can kind of see.
This one?
I think it's the next one right there. So it's the soils south of Cedar Street or north of Cedar Street, and they're going to be consolidated south of Cedar Street. So you can kind of see how, like I say, given the haul route, I can't see why it couldn't be done in 15 minutes.
All right. Marcia, did you want to ask your question now? Thanks for raising your hand back up.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I was curious about the trees. I'm part of a new group called Bozeman Tree Coalition, and I was just wondering, I suspect they died from the injection of the sodium persulfate, maybe around that timing. So I was just wondering how many trees died, and if whose property they're on, and what's going to be done as far as replacing their value in the ecosystem, because if it's city property that they were on, Idaho Poles or neighbors, then they are part of the urban forest of Bozeman. And so I was wondering about that. And then I had, I think I had one other small short question, but mainly I'm very interested in this tree issue.
And that's fine. So the trees are on Scout LLC's property, and Casey, it's probably better for you to talk about how you plan to vegetate as part of the development.
Well, I think we'll definitely be following the city of Bozeman landscaping requirements, which are quite extensive outside of the treated soils area, but we will be avoiding any kind of plantings directly in the soil just to prevent, any kind of future, needs to, any need to dig up trees or be planting in those soils. So it's really just everything outside of the treated soils area.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know probably as a developer, it seems extensive as far as somebody trying to protect the trees that we have in Bozeman from getting cut down. It's not extensive enough. So
Sure. I agree.
they're
The
probably,
trees,
I'm thinking they're the aspen groves maybe that got affected. So those
there
are,
were the trees close to that log office. So there were
okay.
just a handful in there that
Oh,
I was surprised didn't come back as well.
okay.
I think there are bigger aspen groves further down the east, down Cedar Lane, Cedar Drive there.
Well, it'd be great. I'd encourage you to, go above and beyond what the city requires for native plantings. But then the other thing was about, you mentioned, I saw the drawings, the sketch. I know it's just a sketch, but after watching the city uh, regularly for about 3 years now and over 30 years in town, I think that they'll want to see this site developed. I think we can expect that. And when you said you wouldn't be going into the groundwater, I think buildings, they looked like they were 3, maybe 4 stories tall. And don't they need the support to go down 9, 10 feet into the ground to support the walls of a 3-story building?
Yeah, most all of the development we are doing, or all of the development we have planned is south of Cedar Street. We're not developing anything north of Cedar Street, and anything north of the interstate where most all the groundwater monitoring wells are. That's not our property, not where we're developing. We're developing between Cedar Street and the tracks. And of course, big buildings have deep foundations, but our foundations will not be getting down into the groundwater.
Okay. My last question, which I think should be easy to answer, is how are York developers and Scout related? Because I thought on the drawings it said York developers.
Yep, that's our family real estate development company. Scout DAC is just the LLC entity name that owns that site.
Okay,
It's
so
just a-
Scout owns it, but York is the real estate branch.
We're the development company, correct? And we own Scout DAC LLC. It's just a legal entity that we use for that particular site.
Oh, okay. York owns Scout, not the other way around.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Are there other, oh, let's see. Katie said she's concerned that if one drop in an Olympic swimming pool is harmful, how do I protect my child during this excavation? And how can we clean up our home after this relocation is completed to keep her safe?
So the 1 part per billion was groundwater, not soil. So the soil concentration at this point is 1,000 parts per trillion. I don't have a visual to say what 1,000 parts per trillion would look like in a kilogram of soil. But at the question again, Beth.
So she's concerned about the the excavation and the dust that would be flying around and what she could do to keep her child safe. I think, Katie, if I'm remembering right, you were asking about what happens if the dust gets on your possessions and what would be best practices to mitigate that and for protectiveness. And Katie, do you want to clarify your question? I see you came off mute.
Yeah, that's correct. I'm concerned. I live directly across the track, so you're taking the soil and moving it even closer to my home. So how can I keep my family safe?
For the time that the soils is actually not in the ground, correct?
Yes, whenever you're digging it and then dumping it, and then, I mean, the safety plan is that the wind blows east, but if the wind does not blow east, then what?
You know, I appreciate at this point in time, and I appreciate these concerns, okay? Don't get me wrong, but one, I don't even have a work plan from Scout LLC as to how they're going to be doing this work. So it's kind of, you know, you want me to answer hypothetical questions without having something concrete in front of me that I can say, okay, this is what
I'm
Scout
listening to something.
Yep.
Rob, did you have something to say?
Oh,
It's funny. I've been on the board for 23 years, so you were asking the right guy. There's 2 sheets of ice. If you go on the Gallatin Ice online,
did you want to mute that, Beth?
There's
Trying to
they
see,
go from
Rob, are you
Christmas Day
trying to
to midnight every day.
comment? We're not able to hear you very well.
There's more time that is kind of open in the middle of the day, but you're looking for like.
All right. Sorry, I thought Rob was trying to contribute here.
I know, but I still need to answer Katie's question.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead, Roger.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like our concerns should be part of the plan.
No, and I totally agree. And I think that what needs to be done is when we get the plan initially, while we're reviewing it, present it to the public and allow for public input. Is that, okay. And that's what I'm hearing from you, Katie, is that, but I mean, you're asking me a hypothetical without me having a plan to say, this is what we plan to do.
I mean, I don't know if it's hypothetical. You said they are moving the soil from one spot to another.
They are, but at this point in time, I don't have how they plan to move the soil and how Scout plans to address the potential dust so that there is no fugitive dust that moves beyond the area of the construction.
So Katie, we don't really have permission to move the soil yet. There are still steps involved before we actually do the work. And there will be quite a bit much more public involvement. And we will have these community meetings in person, I think, to address your concerns and to show you what we will do. But
Okay,
we're not quite there yet.
And I appreciate that. It's just, I think maybe we're all a little sensitive because in the past we have been alerted of things happening after it's been too late for us to have a voice. So we would like to still have a voice. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yep.
Thanks, Katie. And I see that we have a question in the chat. How has it been done at other locations? This can't be the first time dioxins have been moved. So just asking how it's been done there. And I wonder, I don't know, Casey, I'll defer to you, but it sounds like there may be more detail about that in this public meeting later in the year.
Sure. And you know, these soils that we're moving are coming up out of the floodplain, and yeah, Roger will answer this, and I would go ahead, Roger.
What was the question again, Beth?
How have dioxins been moved at other locations? What's your experience with that?
You know, dioxins were moved at this site back in the 90s, and the concentrations in the dioxins were much higher than they were after being treated. Dioxin soils, let's go with a good example is the Montana Pole site in Butte, Montana, where the land farm was directly where they were actually treating the soils was directly across. They had residential properties directly across the street. And this is a state lead project, Montana, it's still a federal Superfund site, but I can, and Brianna, this may be something you might want to do a little bit of research with Dave, since he's the project officer. But that's probably the best example where they had to probably deal with dust mitigation as well with residential properties in much closer proximity and dioxin concentrations much higher than what we have at Idaho Pole.
Thanks, Roger. And then there was a question or a suggestion that if the contaminated soils could be capped in place and built around instead of moving it. And then Amy clarified that this is the reason that can't be done, to her understanding, is because they're in the floodplain that was put out by FEMA. Is that right, Roger?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
So it's considered a repository by state definition, and state law does not allow for repositories within a floodplain.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat or any other hand raises right now, but please, I'll leave it open just for a couple seconds so we can see that. Okay, I think I am going to stop the meeting recording real quick. Oh, let's see any other chats. I'm going to stop.